Hey, everybody out there, John Marshall for Oncology Unscripted. I promised you my new office. It's not that great, is it? When you get old, they take you from the big office down to the small one. But I do have a view. You see, I've got the view out there, a rooftop. I can see all the air conditioners and whether they're working or not. The helipad's just right over there. So that's going to get exciting sometimes. I got a halo. You see my little halo in the window there? But I am sort of angelic, as you know. But really, the reason we are gathered here today is to talk about maybe my favorite topic, so much my favorite topic that my family is tired of hearing about it, and that is our microbiome. And I honestly feel like it is where our heart and our soul reside. And I, as a good Presbyterian, I actually think this is where the soul must live. And so I am lucky enough to have as a friend and a colleague, Dr. Robynne Chutkan, who is joining us today. She is really an expert in the microbiome. As much as any of us is an expert right now, she's leading the way in understanding this companion that we have through life of these bacteria and other organisms that we grow and live with all our lives. And so she's nice enough to join us today to help us oncology people get a better understanding of the microbiome and its impact on our health. So Robynne, we have spent decades as partners in crime, and I'm so grateful to get reconnected to you. So give the crowd a little bit your background and how the heck did you get interested in microbiome?
Well, first of all, I couldn't ask for a more wonderful kindred spirit in my obsession with the microbiome and stool and all of it. So I knew that we were connected through more than just Georgetown and Lombardi. So thank you for that. I am a butt doctor amongst all these very distinguished oncologists. And thank you so much for the invitation to speak at the Rush Symposium a few weeks ago. One of the things I really saw there was how siloed we are. I was sitting there through the talks thinking, I went to medical school. I was chief resident. I had no idea what you guys were talking about with the pharmaceuticals. And I think some of the oncologists felt similarly when I was talking about Faecalibacterium prausnitzii and short-chain fatty acids and butyric acid. So we're very siloed. But one thing for sure, and I appreciate your comments about the soul and so on, because when you look down at where your GI tract is located, it is smack dab in the center of your body. So there's really no question. It's sort of the engine for everything. And all the organs, your brain, your heart, your lungs, your immune system rely on the nutrients extracted there and the processes to function properly. And
but you're like this highly trained gastroenterologist, and you decided, I can't remember how long ago, to sort of say, this isn't really the way I think we're going to get people better. So maybe talk a little bit about that early revelation on your part. Yeah.
Because it was very personal. I came to Georgetown in 1997, joined the faculty as an IBDologist, gastroenterology primarily focusing on IBD, which had been my focus of my fellowship at Mount Sinai, and very quickly realized that nobody was talking about food, including me. Patients would come in and tell me about their diet, and I was like, okay, that all sounds great. What are you taking? And this was pre-biologics. This was late 90s. So really, I remember actually going to that meeting in Amsterdam for the International Organization of IBD when they were presenting the data on CA2, which became infliximab. It didn't even have a name at the time. And so I was as skeptical as the next about the role of diet, but something happened that really stopped me in my tracks. This was a patient. She actually worked at the hospital, a young woman, and she had relocated to New Jersey. And she came back after a couple of years. She worked in the radiology department, and I saw her, and I said to her, so what are you on? You look great. And she said, I'm on nothing. And I gave my usual spiel of, oh, that's like driving a car with no insurance. That's dangerous, if you have a flare-up. And so I thought, okay, she's feeling right. Well, sure. Let me take a look at her colon. I did her colonoscopy, and she had Crohn's colitis. All the previous cobblestoning and ulceration gone. And I was like, I cannot believe this. You must be taking something. What are you doing? And she told me about a diet she was on called the specific carbohydrate diet.
I thought it was like, because it was the Newark Costco, was just a better Costco. No, it's a diet, actually, she was following.
But I tell you, I was really skeptical. And I wasn't just skeptical, I was afraid for her, because the idea that you could treat inflammatory bowel disease without medication just was so counter to, and I'd been taught by Dr. Janowitz, who was taught by Dr. Crone and came from this sort of IBD world. But I started really looking at this. And what I found, John, I'm sure it's the same in the oncology world, is patients were sort of in this don't ask, don't tell. So we did a survey in my IBD clinic, and we found that 70% of the patients were using some sort of complementary alternative technique. Now, this is 2025. It's very different. But in 1997, 98, this was unusual. And a lot of those modalities were just things like massage, or some of them were doing herbal things, but patients were definitely looking for things. And so I started putting patients on these different diets and so on. We ended up coming up with a modified version of this specific carbohydrate diet, which is sort of a low carb first cousin of paleo, but adding more fiber because it seemed pretty clear that fiber was important for gut health. And we presented that data in 2014 at Digestive Disease Week, and we showed that we actually had a 79% remission rate using this diet. Now, this is 2014, so biologics have been around.
Did anybody believe you? Did anybody believe
Well,
you?
the craziest thing is that all my GI colleagues were in the exhibit hall looking at the scopes, and really a few foreigners, some Europeans, some folks from Asia were interested, but there was zero interest. Crickets. It's so funny that you asked that. So it was a small study. It was 12 patients, 9 ulcerative colitis and 3 Crohn's. But what we showed, not just, I actually had endoscopic images of mucosal healing, which, as you know, is a gold standard for remission, not just patients feel better. And the vast majority of patients were able to get off medication completely or reduce it. One of the things we found when we dug a little deeper with that data is that there was a clear correlation with the amount of fiber. So the patients who just said, okay, I'm going to stop eating the processed breads and pastries and cheese, and I'm going to have bacon and eggs for breakfast, chicken for lunch, steak for dinner with 2 broccoli florets, those patients really didn't have the same results. So there was a clear correlation with the amount of fiber people were consuming.
Connect the dots for me. So it's a diet modification that's changing health, and we're talking microbiome. So I keep thinking about, what is it that's actually take us to pathways in science of like, what's that diet doing to our microbiome in order to sort of rebalance. I think of it as soil. I often use that language in clinic.
Terrain.
What's the best soil?
Yes,
the terrain. How do you make a rainforest, not just a pine forest, right?
That's exactly right. Okay. And so fiber really seems to be key. And I always like to remind people, it's less about eliminating and it's more about adding. You can, overcome a hot dog or a piece of cake if you are eating enough fiber. And by fiber, I don't mean, I always have this as a prop, this granola bar that's been in my drawer for 10 years. Like, I don't mean this. I should have my apple prop, but unprocessed plant fiber, because what that does is poorly digestible, indigestible fiber, the kind that gives you gas, because it's supposed to, because it's not there to feed you, it's there to feed your gut microbes. That fiber is fermented by gut bacteria in our colon, by organisms like Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, ferment it, turn it into short-chain fatty acids. And short-chain fatty acids don't just keep the lining of the gut healthy, they help to modulate the immune system, to sort of keep it at that Goldilocks, not too high, not too low level. And so really critically important. You can't just take a short-chain fatty acid supplement. It doesn't really work that way. These compounds are very labile. And so there is this direct line between fiber consumption, levels of short-chain fatty acids, and outcome. And we saw the same thing during COVID. We saw this UMass study that looked at microbial analysis, and they found that the composition of the gut microbiome, specifically the levels of Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, were very positively associated with better outcomes with COVID and very predictive, 92% accuracy. And what's so interesting, John, some of the same organisms that they found were inversely correlated with outcomes. So Enterococcus faecalis, they saw high levels of Enterococcus faecalis were associated with poor outcomes. We see high levels of Enterococcus faecalis in the colon cancer microbiome. So we're seeing that signature.
So you got diet affecting the rainforest or the terrain, as you say. You've got now, I don't know what the right words are, but healthier balance or the right partners to go through life with. connect that then to health. So in your case, IBD, and most of our audience's cases, is immune responsiveness
Yeah.
to immune therapies, to young people getting colon cancers, to, primaries responding differently than metastases, for example. So can you sort of hypothesize that connecting those dots?
Absolutely. And I think one of the most profound ones is when we think about weight. So we know that we can give two people the identical meal and they will extract different amount of energy and calories from that based on microbial composition. Microbes can change a palate, they can change a metabolism of the foods, they can change the transit of the food through the gut that can determine what's absorbed. So it is less about the meal in some ways. I mean, the meal is still important, don't get me wrong, but your composition of microbes. And again, you can't just go borrow some Faecalibacterium prausnitzii from your plant-eating friend because they only stick around about half an hour or so.
Right.
So one of the things that is very frustrating, and I'm sure you find the same thing because you talk about the CVS aisle that's going to fix all of this, is trying to explain to people it's not just the microbes, it's the environment in which those microbes grow. And we all have plenty of healthy microbes in our gut if we feed them correctly that are going to proliferate and really sort of take root, reproduce, and create shifts. That's much more effective than taking a store-bought probiotic. It's the analogy is you take a cheetah from the plains, the Serengeti, wherever cheetahs live, and I put it in my backyard here near Rock Creek, and I feed the cheetah Cheetos. And the cheetah is not going to do very well. So it's not just the microbes, it's really the environment. And you have to create that environment. And that environment seems to be a high fiber environment. We have data from the American Gut Project published in 2019, 10,000 people from over 40 countries asking that question, what is the most important factor for a healthy microbiome? And the answer seemed to be the amount of plant diversity in the diet. With this magic number of 30. So again, it wasn't being vegan or even vegetarian. It's about eating more plant fiber.
So I first heard that magic number 30 from you just a couple of weeks ago, I've been counting through the week, and I'm actually pretty good. I was already pretty good, but I'm pretty close to that on most weeks. So but thank you for giving me a target, and I've even started to share that
I
with
love that.
patients and other people out there. So I'm grateful. I scour the literature for papers on this subject. And mostly it's the cancer literature I'm looking for. And what I am seeing is increasingly the impact you and others like you are having on science. That, what was kind of fringy when you first started, to be fair, that you've matured this into now being able to start to measure it and to start to be able to influence it for cancer prevention. I've seen literature around CNS disease and dementia, of course, the connection to heart disease, in your world of IBD, et cetera. If you could wave a wand, what would you want to be able to do? What would you want to be able to measure or assess to say you've got a good microbiome and here's how you'll fix yours?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but it's almost like we have to get away from the science a little bit because what I find is we're in this sort of retailization of medicine. It's about selling a product, whether that is a pharmaceutical product or a probiotic at CVS. And people have this idea that if I just buy the right product, I'm going to be fine. So it really is this idea of what sort of platform of health and wellness are we encouraging people to build?
Well, I guess what I'm after is there a Chem 20 for the microbiome, right? So how do I measure it?
Right now, no.
Yeah.
And let's remember, too, that after the billions of dollars and the decades spent on the Human Genome Project, how many genetic diseases did we cure? Right. So just like the genes are just a suggestion, the microbiome isn't magic. It's important. And so right now, there's all kinds of tests we can do. And I, again, look at dozens of these in my office from patients and then tell them, this was interesting, but this really doesn't tell me what's going on. So for example, it's important for people, I think, to participate in these studies, but with things like the American Gut Project, not these more commercial things. So with large databases that are contributing to the science, because, for example, we know that there is a Crohn's signature, if you will. We're not yet at the point where we can diagnose Crohn's definitively with that, and we don't need it because it's a clinical diagnosis. But it's helpful to look at these clinical signatures and then be able to say, okay, if we do this, this changes. But it's not prescriptive in the way that these commercial microbiome companies are selling it, that, if you eat more blueberries and less dairy, you're going to create this. And there's also the issue of association is not always causation, right? Sometimes
Right.
it's the effect, but it's not the cause. I do, though, want to talk about this very important study in the gastroenterology world, which was Paolo Leonetti from back in around 2011, an Italian pediatric gastroenterologist. So he did a study looking at kids in Burkina Faso, in Bulpan, a very rural area of Burkina Faso, and kids in Florence, Italy, eating a very sort of standard Western diet. And what he found was that for breastfed, vaginally born babies, the microbiome was, so microbiota, more correctly, was essentially the same. But as soon as the children sort of graduated to table food, were eating more the local diet, everything changed. So what were the Florentine kids eating? What they eat in the States: pizza, pasta, gelato. And in Burkina Faso, they were eating a high fiber, plant-based diet grown locally, an occasional termite in the rainy season, occasional free-range chicken, but high plant fiber, unprocessed. And when they looked at the levels of short-chain fatty acids, they saw that the kids from Burkina Faso had more than twice the levels of short-chain fatty acids. They had the Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, et cetera, the species associated with leanness and health. And the Italian kids had lower levels of short-chain fatty acids and species that were associated more with diarrheal disease, inflammation, et cetera. And so in terms of this early onset colorectal cancer that we are all very concerned about, as we should be, I think we have to go, sure, things like alcohol and obesity and all of that, and we're going to talk about the ultra-processed foods, but we have to go much further back. In fact, we have to look at how babies are born. My personal interest in this came about because my daughter was born via C-section. She received massive amounts of antibiotics at birth and in her first 2 years of life. She was only breastfed for a few weeks because my breast milk dried up. And as a result, she was a very, very sickly child. And I saw this very similar history in a lot of my IBD patients with lots of antibiotic use early on. We have large data sets now that show that early antibiotic use is a major risk factor for Crohn's disease. So I think these factors now of looking at a 30-year-old and what are they doing, but I think it's really important to say, was this person vaginally born or C-section? Were they breastfed? How many antibiotics did they get in early life? Because I think this stuff is developing decades back.
I've observed that I think there are a lot of only children with early onset colon cancer. And I wonder if there's some sort of helicopter parent phenomenon there. We don't have enough time to cover all of this, but I want you to talk a little bit about ultra-processed foods and what that means. But I also want you to prompt me, because in an hour I have a meeting with the dean of the medical school on another topic. But when we went to medical school, there was maybe 2 hours spent on microbiome. We learned it, we got the test right, and then we forgot it, right? So what should our curriculum be? So talk a little bit about ultra-processed food and then sort of give us a quick version of, if you were in charge of the curriculum right over there, what would you do with that curriculum?
Wonderful. So ultra-processed foods, the NOVA classification, it's not an acronym. It's actually an OVA developed by Dr. Monteiro and colleagues in Brazil. 4 groups. 1 is essentially unprocessed or minimally processed foods, so fruits, vegetables, meat, eggs, etc. 2 is processed ingredients. So that's things like the oils, butter, things like that. So group 3 of processed foods is sort of taking processed ingredients and adding them to an unprocessed food. Okay. But ultra-processed foods are bioengineered ingredients. So when you start to see, the good rule of thumb is if you start to see maltodextrin, I'll read these things.
But let me interrupt there, because don't we need these to feed the planet? We have people dying of starvation. And I personally don't think there's enough money or access to, the Saturday farmers market down in Arlington, right? So how do we balance the need to feed the planet versus this problem you're raising?
That's such an important point, John. But I think there's a lot between farmers market food and ultra-processed food, because let's be clear, these ingredients are not added just to create the food. They're added to increase the shelf life and the palatability, to keep
Fair
us
enough.
eating more, and to make it so this food never goes bad.
Right.
That's not necessary. That's commerce.
Okay. I got you.
And what's really concerning is that a lot of the people eating these foods, these are health adjacent foods. So they're plant milks and gluten-free and dairy-free and bars. And so a lot of the people eating them think they're really healthy.
Yeah.
That they're, being, oh, this is great. I'm eating this gluten-free thing and I'm eating this bar and it only has these ingredients. But these are
We interviewed
foods that
Tim
never-
Cannon a couple of episodes ago, and he was the one who uncovered the fact that ultra marathon runners get more colon cancer. And one of my hypotheses is that because they live on those bars.
The goos, absolutely. The bars and the goos, absolutely. Yeah.
What should I tell the people down campus?
Well, the first thing is it's not either or. We cannot be in a situation where the patients know more about this stuff than the physicians. And I think part of the problem is it's been this like, oh, it's fringe and that's functional medicine. Conventionally trained doctor. I wear a white coat. I have a prescription pad. So we have to, right? We have to bring this into how we're approaching patients, how we're educating patients, and not because otherwise people are getting this from a health coach who's selling them $3,000 worth of useless supplements and telling them not to do chemo. So it is really an imperative that we have to include this and we have to teach our residents and fellows and patients about it.
I'm going to let that be the last word. Dr. Robynne Chutkan, just an amazing discussion, and we could go on for maybe several episodes. Maybe we should, but we have to close it there. We know this is important. We got to figure this out. And I think the better we understand the topic that you are reviewing, the microbiome, the better we will be at preventing disease and treating it once it happens. So Dr. Robynne Chutkan, thank you very much for joining us on
Thanks so much.
Oncology Unscripted.
Thanks for having me. Such a pleasure.